As many of my viewers are already aware, I've vocalized my concerns over government overreach on multiple occasions. I've given examples such as the story of Paul Vaughn, a Tennessean facing 11 years in jail under the FACE Act simply for praying at an abortion clinic. And Paul is among others, such as Mark Houck from Pennsylvania, who was raided in the early morning at gunpoint on similar charges by the FBI. This overreach needs to stop. And on this episode of Forge and Anvil, we will be discussing what everyday citizens might do to push forward state protections against federal overreach. All this and more, so stick around. Welcome to Forge and Anvil, where we hammer out uncomfortable conversations to sharpen ourselves for the cultural, political, and spiritual war that we are living in. My name is Connor. I am host of this podcast. I am a husband, a father, and a follower of Christ Jesus, just doing my best to represent him well every single day. I'm actually joined today by guest Steve Friend, who is an FBI whistleblower, and also in the car with him is Aundrea Gomez from Citizens for Renewing America, and they are in the car. We don't have a video for them. We just have audio. They are making this work. Steve actually just came into town, I believe, just as of a matter of hours ago, or maybe even less, and you can tell me in a moment here, Steve. But either way, they are in town, and Steve is actually going to be doing some very important work here in the state of Tennessee. But we've got a lot of legislation to talk about, a lot of crazy things to talk about going on at the federal level as well. So we'll just get straight into it. So Steve, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to introduce yourself to our audience and those who are not yet familiar.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I just got into town a couple of hours ago. I live in Florida, so I was with the FBI, started in 2014, eventually came forward in 2022 with some protected whistleblower disclosures. So my background with the Bureau was working on violent crimes on Indian reservations for about 7 years, was a SWAT guy, eventually transferred to Florida to work on child pornography and human trafficking, and then was reassigned to work on domestic terrorism. And in my office in Daytona Beach, that meant January 6 cases for the most part, and getting to look at those cases for the first time about 9 or 10 months after the actual incident. It was really clear that the FBI is playing with the statistics as it comes to the way it's handling domestic terrorism, and then also using very aggressive tactics to arrest people, making the process the punishment. So in my office, they were sending a SWAT team to arrest someone who said that they would cooperate when he spoke to the FBI, and he hadn't spoken to the FBI for 18 months. So from my perspective, being a SWAT guy, being an agent, seemed like an unnecessary risk. Brought those concerns forward, and the FBI saw fit to walk me out of the office 30 days later. Wow.
It's wild. Well, we appreciate what you have done and are already continuing to do just for the fight of Americans desiring freedom and preserving our rights. So we really appreciate you being here, Steve. And Aundrea, if you are planning on jumping in here, feel free to go ahead and give an introduction as well.
Oh, sure. Thanks again, Connor. Yeah, so my name's Aundrea Gomez. I am the state director for Tennessee for Citizens for Renewing America. And so Steve and I are colleagues. He's actually a fellow with Center for Renewing America. My job is to support the grassroots across the state of Tennessee on America First priorities. And so this all started with bringing Steve here to Tennessee to talk to groups across the state. And his message resonated with Tennesseans. There's a lot of people out there that are very nervous about what they see happening with the weaponization of our federal government. So, after that visit, we talked a lot in the car, and I thought, why not? We're not just here to talk about problems, we're here to solve problems. So reached out to a couple of Tennessee reps and asked if they would run this legislation, and that's what brings us here today.
Awesome. And thank you for everything you're doing. And we'll get to that in just a moment. I do want to just tell our listeners really quick that if you have not already, feel free to go over to our Substack. That's what makes this podcast possible. It's forgeandanvil.substack.com. You can put in your email for free for updates on the show, as well as free articles by yours truly. And of course, you can also do a paid option to get additional content, including our In the Van segments, where I break down news stories a couple times a week in the early mornings in my van, hence the name In the Van. And one of those stories last week that I covered was actually the very bill that Aundrea was just referencing. So we'll use that as our segue. Aundrea, go ahead and tell us about the bill, and then we can talk a little bit about Steve's involvement and your guys' plan for hopefully pushing this bill through.
Okay, so it is HB 2912, SB 2804, carried by Representative Warner in the House and Senator Hensley in the Senate. It is actually being heard in committee tomorrow in the in the House Criminal Justice Subcommittee at noon tomorrow. So what this bill will do, and Steve, jump in if I say anything wrong, but basically the bill states that local law enforcement shall not participate in FBI joint terrorism task forces. And I'll let Steve explain why we wrote the bill that simply and what it's designed to do.
So awesome. What people need to understand is, and I'll start with what it won't do, because people get a little bit worried when they hear that police aren't going to work on terrorism. What the bill won't do is it won't stop any state certified law enforcement officer from working with the FBI on anything criminal. They can be on task forces to address gangs and violence and drugs, all that. It won't stop any of them from, any state certified law enforcement officer, from sharing intelligence and information to and from with federal law enforcement, the FBI, Homeland Security, any other agency. And it won't stop any state certified Tennessee law enforcement officer from working on terrorism with the FBI or with their own agency. It just prevents them from becoming a task force officer on a joint terrorism task force, which is called a JTTF. And the rationale behind that is pretty simple. If you are a task force officer, essentially you are cross-deputized by the federal government. You get federal arrest authorities. And if you work on a joint terrorism task force, it's national security. You have to have a security clearance to do it, which means you have to have a need to know, because you're getting access to classified material. So if a deputy were to become a task force officer on an FBI JTTF, he would be assigned to work on cases that the FBI deems that need to be worked on, and he could not tell his own sheriff what he was doing. So we've essentially disempowered the sheriff, the chief elected law enforcement official by the Tennesseans in that particular county, municipality, and that is wholly inappropriate. What should happen is the FBI has a righteous investigation, wants to partner with locals on it because they have the local knowledge and the expertise. Then they should bring those concerns to the sheriff, and the sheriff has the need to know, obviously, about what's going on. He shouldn't be disempowered. And then the sheriff can make a call. If he thinks it's an inappropriate investigation, like going after Paul Vaughn, then the sheriff should be able to make that call. It should be within his purview. He's more accountable to his constituents than the FBI is. So that's really the thought process on this. Let's bring the FBI's priorities back into focus onto things that the public expects them and needs them to be working on. Righteous national security investigations, not contrived instances of entrapment where they're just trying to hit quotas.
Right. Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, especially, you're talking about the involvement of the sheriff, and I've been starting to talk about this more and more in my circles about the importance of the sheriff. The sheriff is really one of the most important offices in terms of preventing overreach, because they are the most local elected law enforcement official. And in these instances, the sheriff, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because you would probably know more about this than me, Steve, but really, if this in the case of Paul Vaughn, for example, if this bill was already passed, the sheriff, as long as they're aware of what's going on, they realize it's overreach, they can essentially tell the federal agents to go pound sand and get out of their county. Am I right on that?
Well, there's a supremacy issue. The FBI can bring those charges because a FACE Act violation is a federal crime. They don't need the permission of the local magistrate to do that. But here's my concern, because what we're doing with this bill is specifically tied to national security. And the FBI is increasingly interpreting its national security mandate in a more broad fashion. So they might have brought FACE Act violations against Paul for praying outside. the abortion clinic via some sort of civil rights case. But the days are not far before they're going to start construing that as a domestic terrorism issue. And we saw that about a year ago with the intelligence report that was leaked about radical traditional Catholics. And because it was exposed a little too early, it wasn't ready for prime time, it went back into hiding, but now it's reemerged. And what we are seeing now reported and laundered through these quote unquote nonpartisan institutes and media sources is this Christian nationalism argument. And the argument that is going to be made, and it has already been made by them, like institutions like the Public Religion Research Institute, which is Soros funded but purports to be nonpartisan. They will say that Christianity in itself is a First Amendment protected activity, and the FBI can't investigate that. But they'll say that Christianity is associated with white supremacy. And regardless of any of the adherents, and they'll even admit that if you're black, white, green, blue, you will have similar beliefs across all racial lines within the Christian church. But the FBI will say it's all refracted through white supremacy, and our mandate is to investigate racially motivated violent extremism, which is a subcategory of domestic terrorism. Ergo, we can circumvent the FBI's own declared caveat that it doesn't investigate First Amendment protected activity like religious worship.
Wow, that's very, very sneaky. So what was the name of that organization, the Public Religion
Research Institute, PRRI, Soros funded. It's also affiliated with The Atlantic, which interestingly enough was one of the sources of the radical traditional Catholic report that came out from the Richmond field office last year. And this is all information that's laundered through these policy institutes into the media and then imbibed into the FBI, where an intelligence analyst will take the report from some nonpartisan quote unquote organization, and then it's already been repeated in the media, and now it's been doubly sourced. They will generate an intelligence bulletin or a full intelligence report, and then that will filter its way up into an agent to open an assessment, which is essentially a investigation.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, it's scary stuff that we're talking about here, and unfortunately, I don't think the overreach is like you said, going to slow down anytime soon. I know that just recently, as of Saturday, they announced the National Extreme Risk Protection Order Resource Center at the federal level. Do you know much about that, Steve?
Well, it seems pretty clear to me that we're going to send the DOJ after guns with red flag laws, and they're going to do this after they've been fully funded by a Republican-led House of Representatives. They're going to turn right back around and utilize all the mechanisms that they have at their disposal to go after the Second Amendment, which is anti-constitutional from my perspective, but sort of in keeping with what we've seen under the Attorney General since Merrick Garland assumed that office. And it's more examples of out of control and weaponized government. That is, it comes down to a fundamental question of why do we have laws in the country? And I think most people understand laws to set up guardrails for a polite and safe society, establish justice, ensure safety, and ensure that their evildoers are held accountable. But now, increasingly, our federal government sees laws as just a way to go after its perceived political enemies, and they will reinterpret the actual words that are used to write those laws, and then reinterpret them in a different way because it suits their needs. And they'll go after people that they deem to have problematic beliefs, like being pro Second Amendment, which, interestingly, to refer back to the radical traditional Catholic intelligence report, those were one of the beliefs that they found troubling, that they said made you prone to anti-government extremism, was being pro Second Amendment.
Good grief. That's so wild. Sorry, I'm just slightly taking all this in because it's just crazy to see all these dots that I've already seen kind of floating out separately. It seemed like in my mind, and you're kind of connecting all these dots for me in real time. So it's wild to kind of take all this in. But because Aundrea, maybe to prove my point, Tennessee is in the middle of talking about these red flag laws, and you and I talked about that briefly the other day. And there's currently a red flag law that is being looked at in the Senate. Do you have an update on that for us by chance?
I don't have an update on that, but I can tell you about the one that I was telling you about the other day. There's a bill that has been filed by Jody Barrett, Representative Barrett out of Dixon County. And that bill essentially makes all of these federal mandates that are related to emergency risk protection orders null and void.
Hmm.
And enforcement of any of those is a Class A misdemeanor, I believe.
Hmm.
So that's an important one to watch and support. And I believe that is going to be heard in committee. It was either this week or next week. I'm sorry, I'm not in front of my laptop right now to be able to pull up that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Yeah. And so it seems like this is very coordinated. So, Steve, you obviously have so much more insight than us average Americans with your background. Given the timing of the National Extreme Risk Protection Resource Center, these red flag laws that are being passed in different states, I mean, was this all coordinated, do you think, or is this just coincidence?
I don't think that there's a giant puzzle that all the pieces go together. I just think that it's more like they're all pulling their oars in the same direction at the same time. And what it comes down to essentially is that the people who hold the power view large swaths of the American people very negatively. They view them as the enemy of what they want to implement here. And they are not afraid to use all the mechanisms and levers at their fingertips to go after you. And I'm a fan of this phrase that I've been putting out there, that the process is the punishment for so many people, and they've demonstrated that. Look, I mean, they will use and to the extent that people don't even know. I mean, I'm friends with Steve Baker, the journalist who was arrested for being at the Capitol on January 6th. Well, they held that over his head for 3 years, and then for a non-violent, and he's got no criminal history, no violence in his background. They charged him with 4 misdemeanors. I was taught in the FBI that we don't charge misdemeanors, but leave that as it is. For Special Agent Craig Noyes in Raleigh, North Carolina, he saw fit to bring those charges, and they charged Steve, and as opposed to giving him a summons and saying, hey, you need to come to federal court on this day because it's a misdemeanor, they actually got a judicial complaint, which means they didn't even go to a grand jury, because they wouldn't have gotten a grand jury to return a true bill. They got a criminal complaint, which is typically used for expediting, because this person might be fleeing or at risk of committing some sort of additional fraud or force on another victim. So we have to go quickly. They use that mechanism because it would require an actual arrest of Steve, as opposed to having him turn himself in a suit and tie and looking very professional. They asked him to show up with flip-flops and shorts, and they could have him escorted and frog marched out in front of the cameras. So that's just one example, and then we're seeing that in spades across the spectrum from the FBI and from the federal government.
So obviously this rot didn't happen overnight, but where do you think that this started to take place?
I think that there's always been a problem. I think you can make the argument that the FBI has been extra constitutional since its very origins. I mean, an Attorney General Bonaparte, with a half-a-page memo, created the agency in 1908. It's not like it took an act of Congress. But I think where things really went off the rails was when the FBI got the National Security Counterterrorism Responsibility Enhancement following September 11th, 2001. And at that point was when it was assigned to become the sentry on the wall to protect the homeland. And that's when the focus on combating terrorism in this country changed. And before that, national security meant preserving the continuity of government, protecting our Constitution, protecting civil liberties, and doing the best we could in a free society. After September 11th, on September 12th, the mission became no American dies at the hands of a terrorist on American soil ever again, which is a zero-fail mission, which in essence requires a certain level of tyranny. And then once that happens, the FBI is a bureaucracy, a self-licking ice cream cone. It is in search of a way to grow, which is what bureaucracies naturally do. So when there wasn't enough terrorists for them to hunt down, when our military did a really good job going overseas and hunting them down, then the FBI looked for work and created work for itself. So we had homegrown violent extremism, which were who were Muslim Americans who were accused of being potential terrorists. Most of them were entrapped. And then the same playbook was then used to in the next evolution, which was domestic violent extremism, which parenthetically our own president now has said is white supremacy linked, and militia violent extremism, and parents at school boards, anti-government. And now the latest is the anti-government, anti-authority violent extremist, AGAAVE. AGAVE is the acronym, and the FBI and Department of Homeland Security actually authored a strategic assessment, which they published in 2001, describing the profile of an agave. An agave is someone who has a perception of government overreach, negligence, or illegitimacy. Ergo, any one of the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence would be a domestic terrorist by the FBI's own standards.
Good grief. It's just the lack of self-awareness, or maybe it's intentional lack of self-awareness. It's just ridiculous how that's taken root in our institutions. So you mentioned earlier Christian nationalism. Now I am, I do a lot of talking about theology, and so I have a lot of individuals that have come on the show that, are of the group. When Christian nationalists first reared its head, it was definitely an insult, just used to slander everyone on the right who happened to be Christian and just wanted to take any part in the political process. But now over the last little while, it's turned into this thing where there is a group of Christians that are like, you know what? The term Christian was meant as an insult originally. And we took that on and turned it into a positive thing, at least back when Christianity was viewed positively in America and the West as a whole. And so there's a group that wants to take the term Christian nationalism and Christian nationalists and turn it into something positive. So there's been this whole debate happening in theological circles about whether or not Christians should call themselves Christian nationalists, whether or not Christian nationalism is even a good thing. And it's just a debate, honestly, and I think it's very esoteric. Not a lot of people are honestly following it outside of these individuals online that are super into their theology and their theological arguments. For myself, I have viewed the whole thing with the lens of this started as a smear. So no matter what, I'm going to probably be smeared as a Christian nationalist. So to me, the arguments are a little bit pointless at this time. But there have been individuals like James Lindsay who have been telling this group that I described of these well-meaning individuals that are debating the merit of Christian nationalism. He's been telling them, this is an op, guys. This is an op. It's dangerous. This is all big op. And of course, to me, I knew that anyone to the right of Stalin is going to be labeled Christian nationalists. We recently saw it was MSNBC, I believe, that said that if you believe your rights come from God, you are a Christian nationalist. So in a way, I was proven right. But I mean, is the whole thing an op to go into kind of James Lindsay's warnings? Is there a whole operation happening right now to get individuals to adopt this term just so that they can fall underneath this category? Or is this kind of just a trap that no matter what, they're gonna find a term and label us a term whether we want the term or not, and it's just gonna happen? I mean, what's your take?
I think your last theory is probably the closest to accurate. The nerds get wrapped around the axle and they start debating whether or not they want to own the libs and lean into a term. It doesn't matter. They can call you a scuba diver or a ventriloquist dummy. All they need is a term which they can connect to certain elements that are then give them the ability to bypass their own caveats and restrictions. And in this case, they're going to say that Christian nationalism is, and you can go to, I talked about before, the Public Religion Research Institute, which has really been pushing hard on this. It says that Christian nationalism is tied to white supremacy, even though across racial lines everybody shares the same beliefs. It's refracted through white supremacy, and also tied to voting for Donald Trump. And when I read that, I thought of the Biden speech in front of Independence Hall, where he said that MAGA Republicans were the threat to the country. And that's when things sort of clicked in my mind of, oh, well, that's where they're going to go after the fertile soil for their next potential targets. And that's going to be the way that they bypass their own restrictions on people. And it was most evidence to me in the radical traditional Catholic memo, because they said in that actual intelligence report that the following views made you prone to become an anti-government violent extremist, being pro-Second Amendment, being pro-border sovereignty, pro-traditional marriage, and being pro-life. And those beliefs were problematic. So that is their actual target. It doesn't matter what you label it. And people get into the question of, oh, is it a pejorative or not? It's an intellectual debate. It's really not productive. I'm more interested. I'm a lawman at heart. I want to see what's going to happen, what they're going to use. And I can see that it's the Admiral Akbar. It's a trap sort of scenario here.
Right.
And I don't think it's necessarily a giant op that they're trying to suck you into declaring that about yourself. I just think they're establishing a premise for themselves to go after vulnerable people, which the FBI loves to do. I mean, you are not someone who's going to be at risk of the FBI coming after you unless you are actively doing something like praying outside an abortion clinic. You're too smart to have that happen. The FBI likes to go after people who are vulnerable, people who are financially indigent, maybe even emotionally disturbed. They are very fond of going after autistic young people online and trying to get them to commit to doing things and essentially grooming them into doing it. They go where the soil is fertile, because the dirty secret about the FBI, and this is something that I'm hoping to get out maybe tomorrow, is that the FBI has a quota system. And that is driving a lot of what goes on beyond just the politicization that we're seeing and everybody is absolutely able to identify. Not a lot of people are aware that the FBI has to get a certain number of domestic terrorists every single year in order for their bosses to get their bonuses.
Wow. Yeah. And that's unfortunate, because I think individuals know that about maybe police officers writing up speeding tickets. But, when you put it on that level of how many domestic terrorists have you booked? It's just shocking. So, I mean, do you think that what kind of things can individual people do? We'll talk more in a moment about what you guys are hoping to do tomorrow. But as of right now, what kind of checks and balances currently exist within the agencies to, stop this overreach, if there's any, and beyond those check and balances, what can everyday individuals do to protect themselves from falling into these ops?
I think you need to individually. We need to have a changed mindset here. The FBI is no longer an objective force for good. There's nothing that can be said right now to change my mind on that. If I have a bucket of water and I put a little bit of cyanide in there, I can't drink the bucket of water. There might be all the arguments of the good men and women of the FBI are still doing good work are null and void. All FBI employees receive training that they are to identify when the agency is off the rails and to throw the flag. We all go to the Holocaust Memorial, and that is the purpose of that trip, that you learn about the banality of evil and its potential, and following orders is never appropriate, never sufficient. And people still continue to go to work for them every single day. So as far as I'm concerned, the agency is no longer good. It needs to be shattered and scattered to the winds into 1,000 pieces. Individually, you need to lean heavily on your local elected magistrate, your sheriff, and demand courage from him, because an individual sheriff can divest his deputies from the FBI, pull them out. And here's another little secret about the FBI. There's only 14,000 agents. It is impossible for them to do their jobs without cooperation from local law enforcement. I worked in Daytona Beach. We had 8 special agents assigned to 4 counties with 1 million citizens. We relied a lot on local guys. And if local guys aren't down to clown, then the FBI is dramatically hindered in its ability. And again, if it's being driven by a quota system, they will go where they get the cooperation and leave those other areas alone. Those will be essentially no-go zones, because it's just too hard for them to get their numbers. And then I think we also need to demand more accountability from our elected officials at a state level. We're working on this new legislation, and hopefully can get some traction there. I think that there should be a demand at a federal level. I'm beyond despondent over seeing our federal elected officials fully fund the FBI after I've told them all the information I'm sharing with you right now.
Right.
They have sent the message very loud and very clear that they view a certain level of abuse and weaponization against the American people as being a preferable option to a temporary partial government shutdown, which again is a dereliction of their duty and a betrayal of their oath of office, and they need to be held accountable.
100%. It's so unfortunate, but that's just the Republican Party right now, at least at the national level. And our hope is we can at least do something at the states. While the states are, a little bit closer to home, we can hopefully give them, give them real pressure to make positive change. So that being said, tell us a little bit more about what your plan is tomorrow. So you're now in the state of Tennessee. You're going to go and speak with our legislator. What does that look like?
Hey, Connor, can I add something to
Sure,
the previous
please.
question before I move on to that?
Please.
You're probably not going to anticipate my response on what people need to do, but I'm going to explain it. People need to get their kids out of public school, and here's why. This announcement that was just made by the Department of Justice about this National Extreme Risk Protection Order Resource Center, in that announcement, they acknowledge that this is an example of their commitment to protecting communities from gun violence through the landmark Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Well, that was passed in 2022. And what it does is floods our public schools with money for mental health services, for counseling services, and for data collection, and for additional Medicaid services for those mental health needs. And through that data collection and through those mental health services, the data is being collected on the next generation, but also on their parents. These children and their parents will be identified as ineligible to own their own firearm through the data collection and through these mental health services. So that's a connection that I see through the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which I've been reading since last summer, and how this can be weaponized in your communities, through your schools, and through your children.
Wow. So it seems like they're literally creating a mechanism to disarm the next generation.
That's
and
right.
even their parents.
That's right. Yes. It's real easy to ask, especially elementary age children. So do you have guns in the home? How does your family feel about guns? Have you ever held a gun? Have you ever seen your parents hold a gun? And then they can go further into asking more questions. This is through school climate surveys, threat assessment teams. So there's a lot going on in public education that parents need to be aware of. And the federal government is going to flood our schools with money to promote this agenda.
Wow. That's wild. Thank you for that, because yes, that is something that I was not thinking of, and I'm glad that you threw that out there. And obviously, I've railed before against public education on this show before, but that's a whole new angle that most don't even consider. So thank you for providing that context. But yeah, I'd love for you guys to tell me a little bit more about what your goal is for tomorrow, and what your sort of plan of attack is in the state of Tennessee. How Tennesseans can help, because of course that's the majority of my audience are in Tennessee. I've got a lot outside of Tennessee as well, but for those of us who are actually in the state, what can we do to assist you in this battle? So go ahead and just kind of lay it out for us.
Okay, so I guess I would start with having them call their own representative and state senator and ask them to support this legislation. And then the next step would be to reach out to the Criminal Justice Subcommittee. That's who's going to hear the bill tomorrow. If it passes that subcommittee, it will go on to the full Criminal Justice Committee. So that would be the next step, is to move on to that committee. We're expecting the bill to be heard in the Senate next week, and that'll be the Senate Judiciary Committee. So for your listeners, they would go to the General Assembly website and look under the committees and find the committee they're looking for, and then you can see all of the members that sit on that committee. Connor, I'm happy to forward some talking points, as well as a copy of the amendment that makes the bill. So that would be the first thing that we need. We definitely need prayers for tomorrow.
Right.
Prayers for travel up there, as it's storming right now. I'm not sure what's expected for tomorrow, but we need prayers for Steve's testimony. We are going to be visiting with some legislators tomorrow before noon when the committee meets. And so, just pray for, wisdom and good conversations about that, and clarity. And then we also do have a special person coming to testify tomorrow that was just finalized yesterday, and that is Mr. Paul Vaughn himself is going to be testifying in committee.
Wonderful.
There are organizations in our state that are opposed to this legislation, and they will be testifying against it. So you can pray for confusion on their parts, I suppose. And other than that, we just need support for this. For your listeners that don't live in Tennessee, I think they need to consider in their next legislative session bringing forth this type of legislation and rallying behind it. The states are going to have to really take the lead on protecting their own citizens against the federal, the overreach, the weaponization of these agencies. It is up to the states to do that. You've got to put a hedge of protection around your citizens.
Yeah, I completely agree. And this really seems like something that you would think, given the severity of everything that we're talking about, you would think that this would be enough to push a governor to call a special session, because some of these legislative sessions are ending or they're at the tail end. And, you just would think that this is big enough that a governor wouldn't want to put this off. So I don't know. Do you guys have a plan to put pressure on governors like DeSantis or Kim Reynolds over in Iowa? Some of these more Kristi Noem, some of these stronger conservative governors, to try to pressure them into getting a special session together to specifically address this?
We haven't talked about for special session. I find the appetite for doing that, the will to do a special session in an election year is really not there. As much as it makes sense to you and I to do that, the legislators aren't necessarily going to see it the same way. That doesn't mean that some of them won't. We can always ask. You can ask for the moon. But I would say that in the very least, when they reconvene, next year for this, I don't know how every legislature works, what their calendar looks like. Some states are full-time, some are part-time. So I guess it really just comes down to that. And if they're able to file something, if they haven't passed a deadline or something like that. But happy to talk to people from other states about this bill. It's pretty simple. We can definitely share it as model legislation for other states. And then let them take it and run with it. I'm hoping Tennessee is going to lead on this and start a trend and a ripple effect for sure.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely be praying that it does. Steve, you mentioned a moment ago before we started recording that you've been reaching out to legislators in Florida. Have you gotten much appetite among other states in general? Obviously Tennessee, it seems like we're the tip of the spear for this, but who's kind of next in the wings?
I've had some interest in Florida. It was really late in the legislative session. I've had some interest actually in Idaho. I think ultimately, though, if we have this go through in Tennessee, we have a proof of concept at that point, and that really starts a snowball effect. The biggest pushback that I've heard that that I think there was always a worry that you're not going to be addressing actual counterterrorism needs, and nobody wants to have anything bad happen. But the biggest pushback that we're going to see, and I think we'll see some people speak out against tomorrow, is the fact that the federal government brings resources to bear. They pay the overtime for task force officers that join a joint terrorism task force, and that's a golden handcuffs. That's tough for any sort of sheriff to forego that. But what I'll say tomorrow, and I'll continue to echo, is if you swear an oath to your state constitution, to your federal constitution, if you're in a position of public trust, you need to be able to answer the question that you believe that there's a certain amount of weaponization and abuse of Tennesseans or whatever citizens that we're talking about that is acceptable as long as Uncle Sam pays your overtime. And when you say it that way, I think that it puts a stark contrast into what is should be your motivating factor if you enter a position of public trust.
Yeah, I agree with that. So, what kind of creative ideas, can we kick around for incentivizing those individuals to take our side? Because you're right, they're golden handcuffs. And although I would love to believe that everyone is altruistic and genuine and has a great upright character, that's unfortunately we're falling we're fallen men. But I think that in a way we can be political about this and try to create incentives to have individuals uphold the constitutional oath. And they actually have support behind that. So have you thought of any ideas in that realm before, Steve?
Well, I think from a political messaging standpoint, that I know people on the right are loath to embrace a defund the police sort of slogan.
Right.
This is not doing that. This is empowering the local police. This is empowering the real police. So much of what we see in federal law enforcement is actually law enforcement cosplay. They are taking the work of good deputies and good police officers and detectives and simply just taking the actual paper and putting their name on it and taking credit for it. I think we need to rely on the real police that do protect their communities, that have the local knowledge, know the usual suspects, know the crimes that are afflicting a particular area, and they're incentivized to actually bring crime down. Whereas the FBI wants to bring the crime stats up so it can say, hey, look how successful we were to the Congress. You gave us 11 billion. Why don't you give us 12 or 13 billion? And we'll just keep bringing in the numbers for you. So I think from a messaging standpoint, that's key. But I think just as far as an effectiveness standpoint, this will actually make it better because it brings the actual focus to real crimes and real national security threats, as opposed to we're going to play on the edges and see if we can't contrive a way to justify our existence by entrapping a vulnerable person into a terrorist plot that they were never predisposed to engage in without the involvement of the FBI. If there are legitimate threats, we need to direct our resources and our attention to those. And passing this law will do that because now the FBI has to bring its cases to the sheriff, and the sheriff will be in a position to essentially say, that's not a legitimate case, and expose it. And the FBI fears being exposed and embarrassed more than anything else. So the FBI will be incentivized to bring righteous cases to those sheriffs and those police chiefs. And that's how we can best use our resources and best use our manpower and our knowledge and our skill set to actually address those real threats. So I think it'll actually make it better as far as a public safety standpoint.
That makes sense. So at the time of recording this, it's Monday night. It's late Monday night. I initially do these pre-recorded segments and release them on Thursday. I may bump this one up just given the importance of everything that you guys are doing, but there's still a chance with just wanting to make sure that I don't throw it out at 3 a.m. to an audience of no one. I want to make sure that we actually get eyes on this. So there's a chance that this may come out after you've already testified. So Aundrea, you said that you believe that the actual voting on this, if it proceeds past the committee that you're going to be testifying in front of, Steve, if it passes that, probably next week is when we would actually get a vote on this. Is that what you're suspicious of, Aundrea?
Yeah. So they will vote on this in the subcommittee tomorrow. If it passes, it will go to the full criminal justice committee, the full committee, and they will hear the bill again. We may be able to have Steve come back and testify again. I'm not sure. And then they will vote on it again. So bills usually have to be passed and heard 3 times before they go and get signed by the governor.
Right.
And so, I realized something while Steve was talking. Another thing that your listeners can do is to just actually further educate themselves on the issues. And Steve has put out a lot of really good material on this issue. He, if your listeners go to americarenewing.com, they can scroll through. I think it's under Woke and Weaponized, and they can find some of his primers that he's written in there, as well as a series of videos that where he talks about and explains the systemic problems within the FBI. So I know that this is not everyday conversation for most of your listeners,
Right.
and so you need to hear things more than once to fully understand it.
Right.
So that's what I would recommend. Another way for your listeners to really understand what the true problem is. I think a lot of people recognize there's an issue, but they don't necessarily know how to articulate the issue. So go and read and listen and follow Steve on X. What's your Twitter handle? At Steve Friend?
Real Steve Friend.
Oh, at Real Steve Friend.
Real Steve Friend.
Yeah, and he's He's embarrassing the FBI on a regular basis on X.
Yeah, and well, us everyday citizens appreciate everything that you're doing, Steve. So please keep up the good fight, and we will be praying for you. And I will be blasting this out to everyone I can. I don't have a large audience, but the good news is most of my audience is in the state that we're focused on. So that's going to help drive this forward, I believe. So we'll do our part. As a podcast and as an audience. So we really appreciate you. And Aundrea, go ahead and shout out your information as well. And Steve, if there's anything additional you want to plug, go ahead.
So you can follow me on Twitter. I'm not nearly as exciting as Steve, but it's at Aundrea Go, and that's AUNDREAGO. And then, Steve, plug your.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm on X at Real Steve Friend. I do basically just take everything the FBI puts out and actually read it and digest it and expose what it actually is saying. So I read the fine print, and I think that sorts of illuminates the level of deception and weaponization that they're doing. I also do a podcast with another whistleblower, and we do that on Rumble. It's called the American Radicals Podcast, rumble.com/amradpod. Garrett O'Boyle and I testified in front of Congress last year, and he and I put that show out as well. And then, just americarenewing.com. And even if you go to About Us and our staff, you'll see a picture of me with my teeth smiling. And if you click on my face, it has links to all the different primers that I've written in the videos. And those videos are about 2 minutes long each. There's 10 of them. So they're very digestible and shareable for folks to give to their friends.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, both of you. Really appreciate it. And thank you, listener. Please do share this. It's a really important episode. We would really appreciate you guys making this go as far as possible. So we will see you all next time.